Let me begin with giving you some hopefully very up-to-date facts about where we stand in Operation Pillar of Defense. Since the operation began on November 14th, we have had nearly 1,200 rockets fired from Gaza onto Israel. Almost all of these rockets have come from Gaza, but some of them came from Sinai, which is very significant. For the sake of comparison, in the 4 days prior to the operation, if people ask you, well, why did Israel start the operation? In the 4 days prior to the operation, we had 120 rockets fired from Gaza onto Israel. This was before Israel targeted Ahmed Jabari, essentially the chief of staff of Hamas. But of course, you never hear about this in the media. This trickle, this daily reality of rocket after rocket after rocket coming, until Israel responds, you don't hear about it in the media. But those are the facts. If we adopt a slightly longer-term historical perspective, does anybody know when was the first time that a Qassam missile was fired on Israel from Gaza? Anybody wants to hazard a guess? 30 bonus points to anybody who gets this right. Anybody has any idea? Yes? The back? No, you're just stretching. It's like my students, you know. It was April 2001. So this was before 9/11. Back then, the Qassam missile was nothing more than a steel pipe filled with gunpowder, and it had a sort of a primitive detonator and essentially a grenade stuck on top. This was in April 2001. Fast forward almost a dozen years, Israel has been targeted by over 10,000 rockets since that time. 10,000 rockets. And of course, over time, the lethal power, the sophistication, the range of these rockets has only grown and grown and grown and grown. 974 missiles were fired in 2006. This means a 500% increase in the number of rockets that were fired after Israel removed every last soldier, every last settlement, every last presence of the occupation from Gaza. And we'll speak about the significance of that 500% rise. There was a reduction in the number of rockets following Operation Cast Lead in late 2009, early 2010. But that operation never achieved quiet. Even in 2010, we had over 120 rockets fired into Israel. And by 2011, the deterrence that was established vis-a-vis Hamas during Operation Cast Lead was already beginning to get weaker. We had 375 rockets in 2011. In 2012, as of November 18th, we have had 1,597 rockets fired onto Israel. So we see that the previous experience has been that when Israel has taken action against Hamas, it has achieved a reduction in the number of rockets to a level of 100, 200 rockets instead of levels of 700, 800, 900 rockets every year. Coming back to what is happening right now, since the start of the operation, the Israeli Air Force has struck approximately 1,400 targets in Gaza. It has not taken any action in Sinai, of course, and we'll speak about that, about Israel's tremendous care not to undermine the Camp David agreements, right? The Camp David peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, even though attacks are coming in from the territory of Egypt. In the first 48 hours of the operation, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad shot 600 rockets into Israel. Over the past 48 hours, the number has dropped. Unlike on the Palestinian side, you don't see the Israeli trauma. I don't want to get into this issue of the psychological asymmetry between Israel and the Palestinians, but it's clear that Israelis mourn in the way that people traditionally do in the West. We do it privately. We don't make our dead civilians and our dead babies into media spectacles. We respect the privacy of the families. Any injuries and blood that is spilled on the street is very quickly cleaned up. Nobody is allowed to film it and put it on YouTube, and certainly not to use it for media purposes. We do not make display of our dead babies. Manishtana, what is different at this time from previous operations? The first thing that is different is preparation on the Israeli side. It is clear that both in terms of preparing for the first strike that killed Jabari, and in subsequent move, including the recruitment of 75,000 reservists who are still waiting to see whether a land invasion will go forward or not, Israel was much better prepared this time than it was certainly in 2006, but also it seems as we get deeper and deeper into this operation compared to the CAS-led operation in 2009. So far at least, as we say in Israel, tfu, so far at least, it is Israel that is setting the pace. It is doing so from a very carefully organized playbook of how to target the right targets, how to do it precisely, and so forth. And Hamas seems to be on the back foot, which was not the case with Hezbollah in 2006, and to some degree was not the case in 2009. The scale of the targeting this time around is much, much greater. Just to give you a sense, throughout the entire Operation CAS-led, 3-week operation, there were 150 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad targets that were hit by the Israeli Air Force. In a week, the Israeli Air Force, as I've said, has hit over 1,400 targets. This, of course, doesn't only goes to demonstrate the degree to which Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad have built up a terrorist infrastructure in Gaza, so there are many more targets to hit, but it also shows you shows to me, meticulous intelligence and preparation. The Netanyahu government has been planning for this contingency for some time. This is not a spontaneous operation. What also has changed dramatically is the issue of precision. If you think about it, 1,400 strikes from F-16s, F-15s, helicopters, drones, and fewer than 30 Palestinian civilians is a ratio of military success that is absolutely incredible. The future of warfare, for Israel at least, is going to be about precision. Because there's an understanding that we don't want to harm the civilian population, of course, but we also understand that our legitimacy and our ability to defend ourselves will be greatly improved the fewer civilian casualties there are. Another big difference is the cyber dimension of this war. So far, there have been almost 60 million cyber attacks on Israeli government, media, banking, insurance, and so on and on, attacks that were carried out. These go both ways. The Israelis conduct a cyber attack on the Palestinians, on Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas conduct a cyber war against Israel, aided by Iran, aided by hackers from anywhere from Indonesia to Morocco. This is a global cyber war that is happening. Very, very interesting from a security point of view. But the war is also happening in the social media realm, Facebook, Twitter. You can go on Twitter and see the Palestinian Islamic Jihad Twitter page and follow what they are saying about this conflict. Finally here, the issue of legitimacy. The issue of legitimacy. Our Chief of Staff, Benny Gantz, when he speaks about contemporary warfare, he speaks about what he calls the fifth dimension of warfare in the 21st century, which is legitimacy. Israel has realized that you can win a military battle and lose a political fight, and lose a political war. And this is something that you are on the front of the legitimacy fight. And Israel is taking the legitimacy dimension of this battle very seriously, not only on the issue of precision and avoidance of Palestinian civilian casualties, but also in terms of its hasbara, right? Its public diplomacy, the cyber dimension, the social media dimension of this conflict. These have all evolved dramatically in the last 2 years. In terms of the goals of the operation, again, Israelis are not famous for being people who tend to understate things. To put it in an understated manner. But one of the lessons that the Israeli government learned from previous experience is to set much more modest goals for this particular operation, right? So, if in the past the stated objective was to topple Hamas, right, to end Hamas's rule over Gaza, to restore Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority, as if that's a große Metzia, as they say in Yiddish, but to restore the Palestinian Authority as the lesser of two evils to Gaza, the goal today is essentially a long-term ceasefire along the Israel-Gaza border. And this means two things, essentially. One is that they stop firing rockets at us, and secondly, that they stop attacking Israeli border patrols, of course, on the Israeli side of the border. So this is what Israel wants. What does Hamas want? Why is Hamas doing this? Okay, so the first thing Hamas is trying to do is to achieve a repeat of what it sees as Hezbollah's success against Israel in 2006. Okay? Basically, Hamas wants to harm Israel because the very raison d'etre of Hamas is jihad. It is fundamentally a resistance organization, and without active resistance, Hamas loses its own credibility. Number two, Hamas wants to isolate Israel diplomatically. It wants to advance a campaign of the delegitimization of Israel, and it thinks that by drawing Israel into an asymmetrical war, it will advance that aim. Number three, Hamas sees itself in the aftermath of the Arab Spring as the vanguard, as the head of a wider Islamist rise, a Sunni Muslim Brotherhood-led Islamist rise throughout the Middle East. This Islamist rise, of course, now also includes Egypt, which is in the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood. It also includes Tunisia, but also, interestingly, it also includes Turkey. It includes the AKP. And you saw, these past few days, the contours of a new pro-Hamas alliance being formed in the Middle East, led by Turkey, which I want to remind everybody until recently was a close Israeli ally, led by Morsi, and led by Qatar, which is providing much of the money. This is the new Islamist, Sunni, Muslim Brotherhood, rising governing elites of the Middle East. And Hamas views itself as not only being equal to these guys, but really being the pioneer, really being the one who took over Gaza in 2006 and established the first Muslim Brotherhood, because Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, after all. Hamas being the vanguard, the one that established the first sovereignty, if you like, in Gaza of a future caliphate, Muslim Brotherhood-led state. Finally, Hamas is being compelled to attack Israel by its main patron, Iran, who is keen to divert Israeli and international attention from its fast-advancing nuclear program, and who is building the Palestinian Islamic Jihad as an alternative to Hamas? Should Hamas reorient its loyalties and its allegiance towards the Muslim Brotherhood? So do you see what's going on here? There's an internal Palestinian political story going on here. Because of the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and because of the ideological and historical affinity between Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, Iran is afraid that it will lose Hamas as a proxy to attack Israel. And therefore, it is pressuring Hamas to prove that it is still leading the resistance, and it is building up the Palestinian Islamic Jihad to put pressure on Hamas and as a potential proxy, a replacement, so it can make sure that even if Hamas concludes a long-term ceasefire with Israel, Palestinian Islamic Jihad will continue to fire rockets at Israel. Let's look at the firepower of Hamas today. They are armed by Iran. A huge number of weapons have been smuggled from Libya, through Sudan, through Sinai, into Gaza. And they are also producing increasingly sophisticated long-range missiles in Gaza. And you know what the great irony is? That we, the Israelis, supply Gaza with the electricity that allows the production of these missiles. It's an insane situation. Why do we supply why do we supply Gaza with electricity? Because we don't want to harm the Palestinian population that lives there. Because we know that the sewage system in Gaza is dependent on us continuing to supply electricity to it. We know that heating and the central infrastructure of hospitals and so forth are dependent on Israel continuing to supply electricity to Gaza, and so we do it. But the ridiculous irony is that we are supplying electricity to people who are producing rockets who are then shooting it on our civilians. It's an insane situation. It's meshuggah, as they say in Arabic. This is no longer a conventional terrorist organization in the way that Europeans tend to think about terrorist organizations. This is not the IRA. This is not ETA. This is a shadow state with tremendous firepower, ideology, allies. This is not Israel is the strong and the poor, weak Palestinians. The truly last thing that I want to see is that we will emerge from this round with a sense that Hamas has won and Israel has been beaten. Because the consequences of that will be nothing short of disastrous. And what will be the consequences? First of all, this will be the end, maybe the final nail in the coffin of the land for peace formula. Because it will confirm for the Israeli public once again that every piece of territory that Israel will cede to the Palestinians will not be a step towards peace, but it will be hijacked by radicals and used to build a terrorist camp from which to attack Israel. This will be another confirmation after the Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon that led to the rise of Hezbollah, and after what has happened in Gaza over the past few years, that no way are we going to make any territorial concessions, because the result will be a repeat of what has just happened. That will be disastrous to peace. Secondly, it will weaken further an already weak Palestinian Authority and Abu Mazen. It will show that violence pays off, that terrorism pays off, and it will embolden the radicals. And it will embolden the radicals not just in Gaza, but it will embolden Hamas to be more aggressive about taking over the West Bank. It will embolden Hamas and other jihadist groups to be more aggressive about undermining the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, which is already in not such great shape, by the way, you should know. It will send a clear message, another clear message to the Muslim Brotherhood that God favors them, that their time in history has arrived, that the Zionists are on the run, and that they can become increasingly aggressive in pursuing their theological agenda. It will embolden radicals across the Middle East, from the West Bank to Jordan to Syria and Lebanon. I would also like to say that the return to the old ceasefire formula, what in Arabic is called tahida, or calm, a period of calm, won't last. It won't work. Why? Because Hamas does not have a monopoly on the use of force in Gaza, right? For the reasons that are articulated. Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other factions will act as spoilers and will act to undermine any ceasefire that Israel and Hamas reach, and Iran will do everything in its power to make sure that the ceasefire collapses, because it wants to draw Israel into war with Egypt, ultimately. Unless a build-up of Hamas's weapons and arsenal is stopped, Gaza will soon rearm, and over time it will become an even greater strategic threat to Israel, and this will force Israel to take preventive action, so the ceasefire will collapse. Again, even Israelis are capable of learning, and especially at the IDC, I should say. And Israel has seen what the consequences of the 2006 Lebanon war were. Is Hezbollah weaker today than it was in 2006? No, it's stronger. In fact, it's probably 3 or 4 times stronger. So we have seen how quickly these guys don't only replenish their weapons after a successful campaign against Israel. There will be many elements in the Middle East that will line up to help Hamas rearm, but they will get stronger. And of course, every round, not only we learn, but the bad guys learn as well. And their learning curve is sharper than ours, because they start from a much lower point of view. The sophistication of Hamas today is much greater than it was in 2009 and greater than it was in 2005. If we allow this to continue, we will see the Hezbollahization of Gaza and of Hamas, with increasing firepower and increasing destructiveness on their part. So time, in this sense, is playing to them and not to us. Israel understands that we need to build the foundations of peace. That unless there is a Palestinian entity that has the political and economic institutions to make it capable of living in peace with Israel, simply signing a peace agreement will mean nothing. But this also means that Abu Mazen needs to abandon his unilateral move at the UN to achieve recognition. Abu Mazen should understand that peace needs to be negotiated with Israel. It can't be imposed by the international community. And Abu Mazen needs to understand that if he thinks that he can gain recognition of statehood so that he can file war crime allegations at the International Criminal Court against Israeli politicians and soldiers, that will not advance peace. That will lead us towards conflict. But we certainly need to take more steps to weaken the radicals and empower the moderates. We need to provide Israel with strong American and European backing for immediate action should the Palestinians resume fire. It is simply intolerable that we should have the international community be silent about dozens and hundreds of rockets that are being fired on Israel every year. And it's only when Israel responds that the international community wakes up. And before we sign any kind of ceasefire agreements, I would like to see American and European guarantees that they will back us up if we have a return to this crazy situation where our citizens are being targeted like sitting ducks. We need to put tremendous pressure on Egypt. Egypt is the sovereign in Gaza, in Sinai. Israel is not responsible for Sinai. It's the Egyptians who are responsible for Sinai. And so we need to put great pressure on the Morsi government to play by fair rules of the game. And at the moment, Egypt is in dire economic need, and it is negotiating a package of assistance from the EU, from the Americans, from the IMF. The EU is the largest donor to Egypt. We should link much more closely economic aid, technical assistance, military aid to the Egyptians, on the Egyptians being responsible sovereigns. And I believe we should also leave a door open for Hamas, if it recognizes the State of Israel, if it stops terrorist activity, if it agrees to adhere by international agreements, then Hamas could become a legitimate partner for talks. And if Hamas ceases fire and accepts reasonable rules of the game, we should be able to do business with them if needed.